Thank you. That concludes topical questions. The next item of business is a debate on motion 20135 in the name of Russell Finlay on motion of no confidence. I'd be grateful if members who wish to speak in the debate were to press their request to speak buttons now. And I call on Russell Finlay to speak and move the motion. Mr Finlay.
No, sir. Today my party brings forward this motion of no confidence in the Justice Secretary, and I'll now explain why this is a necessary course of action. In my 4 years at Holyrood, I've had more dealings with Angela Constance than with any other member of the government. Our encounters have usually been courteous, sometimes fiery, and mostly serious. We fundamentally disagree on the SNP's approach to justice. This can be defined as seeking to excuse criminal behaviour, which I believe fails crime victims and Scotland's law-abiding majority. I disagree with their closure of police stations and releasing hundreds of prisoners early. I disagree with gender self-ID in the justice system and weak bail laws. I disagree with unjust under-25 sentencing guidelines and a £1 billion tag for a new prison. And I also disagree with the government's position on grooming gangs. But this motion and today's vote are not about the fact we disagree. They are about the conduct of the Justice Secretary. This is about the fundamental importance of honesty and integrity in government and in Parliament. No matter the attempts of John Swinney, Kate Forbes and other SNP members, Angela Constance's conduct is inexcusable and her position is no longer tenable. The starting point for today's proceedings was 16th of September, when my colleague Liam Kerr lodged an amendment to the Victims' Bill. That sought to begin the necessary work of establishing a grooming gangs inquiry, an inquiry that would answer questions about the sickening sexual exploitation of children, that would establish why so many were so badly failed, why abusers acted with impunity, why whistleblowers were silenced. This amendment was imperfect, but the only mechanism at our disposal. And in rejecting it, Angela Constance cited leading abuse expert Professor Alexis Jay. The Justice Secretary said that Professor Jay shared her view that a groomings gang inquiry was not needed. Except Professor Jay did not say that. And she did not say that because that's not her position. Now, 10 days later, Professor Jay emailed the government to object. At that point, the Justice Secretary was obligated to correct the parliamentary record as stipulated by the Ministerial Code. She had 20 days to do so, but she didn't. Instead of coming clean, it was decided that a correction would be made to the online minutes of the National Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation Strategic Group, buried on an obscure government webpage and not posted until the 18th of November. Then, on the 26th of November, more than 2 months after misrepresenting Professor Jay, Angela Constance doubled down. She publicly denied that she had misrepresented Professor Jay. When asked if she had misled her, Angela Constance said, "No," and I quote, "No, certainly not. I gave an accurate quote, and indeed the correspondence that Miss Jay sent to me acknowledged that the quote that I gave was accurate." In the chamber, I note that we are not allowed to use the words lie or call anyone a liar, so I won't. But little wonder that Professor Jay sent another email to the government on the very same day. And in her email she said, "The current position is unsatisfactory for me." And after all of this, misleading the public, Parliament and grooming gang victims, Angela Constance has still not admitted her mistake. She's still not corrected the record. She's still not apologised. And that's the problem here. Not that a mistake has happened, but that Angela Constance, John Swinney and the whole government want to pretend that it never happened and that it doesn't really matter. Well, it did happen, and it should matter. Many will see this tawdry defence of the indefensible for what it is, the typical actions of a calculating and cynical government. A First Minister who can look grooming gang victims in the eye and tell them that he cares, only to destroy his own warm words with his cold inaction. I've met with Taylor, who from the age of 13 was drugged and gang raped, and who was failed by the authorities who should have protected her. And a recurring theme with grooming gangs is the conspiracy of silence in which police, social workers and others failed victims over fears of being branded racist. Survivors say there's an evidence of institutional cover-up. They're forced to battle for records, many of which no longer exist or have been severely redacted. Taylor raised this exact issue in her meeting with John Swinney on the 9th of December. And a letter to all MSPs from Taylor's mother says, and I quote, "Within 24 hours of leaving Bute House, the suppressed email from Professor Jay was made public." Do John Swinney and Angela Constance really not understand what message their conduct sends to victims who already lack trust in authority? When he became First Minister, John Swinney made big statements about restoring the relationship between the public and politicians. Earlier this year, he said, and I quote, "Renew public trust in politics." Well, he's got the opportunity to do so today. Except, we all know that he won't. Even though he won't do the right thing, each of us can do the right thing. And here's the choice. We can say that it's acceptable for ministers to mislead and to cover up, or we can say that there should be reasonable consequences for doing so. This is about truth. This is about respect. This is about simple decency. And I therefore urge every MSP here today to vote to remove the Justice Secretary for misleading the Parliament, the public and grooming gang victims. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on the First Minister.
Presiding Officer, the safety and well-being of children in Scotland is a paramount concern of all of us as members of Parliament, no matter our politics, no matter whether we are members of an opposition party or a supporter of the Scottish Government. The safety and the well-being of children in Scotland matters to us all. Like many members here today, and Russell Finlay has quoted some of my recent experience in this respect, I have personally spoken to survivors of abuse to hear of their experiences, and I discussed these issues with Taylor and her family last week. One of many, many conversations I have had with abuse survivors. There is no doubt in my mind, and it's obvious to all, that many, many people have been fundamentally failed by the system over the years. That is shameful, and facing up to that awful reality has underpinned the approach of the Scottish Government. Every member of my government is committed to doing everything possible to deliver justice and the possibility of some element of closure for victims of the past, as well as keeping safe the children of today and tomorrow. That sentiment anchors the steps that have been taken by my government in addressing these issues, and those issues are being addressed, contrary to what Mr Finlay has said to Parliament today. First, we established a year ago the Expert National Multi-Agency Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation Strategic Group, which is considering previous inquiries, evidence and practices across social work, education, police and healthcare to agree further actions and recommendations for national improvement and reform. Professor Alexis Jay, who has always been a member of that group, has now been appointed as its independent chair. Secondly, an independent national review of the response to group-based child sexual abuse and exploitation in Scotland is being established. This will be undertaken by the Care Inspectorate, His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary in Scotland, His Majesty's Inspector of Education and Health Improvement Scotland. The inspectorates are statutorial independent of government, and the agencies they scrutinise and are able to compel public authorities to provide information they request. Professor Jay has agreed to provide expert advice at key stages of the process. Alongside that work, Police Scotland are continuing to review child abuse and sexual exploitation cases. I received an update from them on this important work when we met recently, and opposition leaders and spokespeople across the Chamber have been offered a briefing with Police Scotland on this work in the new year. And we will also draw on the published evidence and reports of the Independent Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry established by Angela Constance in 2015, which has been considering the abuse of children in the care of the state. The inquiry has now commenced phase 10 and made clear that there is scope to hear and act upon evidence relating to group-based child sexual abuse and exploitation, where this falls within its terms of reference. All of this activity, Presiding Officer, underlines the seriousness with which my government takes this issue and our determination to leave no stone unturned, guided by expert opinion. We have, over several occasions in this chamber, discussed the comments at the heart of today's debate, so let me reiterate what has already been stated. During stage 3 of the Victims, Witnesses and Justice Reform Bill, in relation to Liam Kerr's amendment that the new post of Victims Commissioner should carry out research into child sexual abuse, the Justice Secretary raised awareness of the work led by Professor Alexis Jay. The Cabinet Secretary noted specifically that Professor Jay had been the chair of an independent inquiry into child sexual abuse in England and Wales, and drew on a comment made in the past that in regard to child sexual abuse and exploitation, that, and I quote, "people should just get on with it," close quotes. Following correspondence with Professor Jay, it was minuted at the Strategic Group's meeting in October that the quote was correct and was from January, but not made in relation to the amendment or the Victims Bill. The Cabinet Secretary in the debate in September did not state that Professor Jay was speaking directly about the amendment. She made a general point drawn on the publicly stated views of Professor Jay. Now, I acknowledge...
Let's hear the First Minister. Mr Kerr. Thank you. First Minister.
I acknowledge that members of Parliament and members of the public will draw different conclusions from the words we all use. I know, and I would imagine most members know this too.
Let's hear the First Minister.
That Angela Constance is a sincere minister who would never address Parliament in a way that would in any way mislead Parliament or the public. That is evident to me in the way in which Angela Constance has, over a period of almost 2 years, openly and with candour, shared with Parliament the very acute challenges we face in dealing with the rising prison population and the incredibly difficult decisions that we must take on this issue. Presiding Officer, there is vital work to be done to protect children, and getting on with this work has been what my government has been doing, just as it has been getting on with a raft of other reforms. For example, in Justice, Angela Constance in the last 18 months has successfully steered 4 crucial acts through this Parliament, including the Victims, Witnesses and Justice Reform Act, which delivers the biggest reforms for victims of crime in the history of devolution.
First Minister, sorry, there is a lot of noise in the chamber. I would very much like to hear those who have called to speak, and I'm sure other parliamentarians would too. First Minister.
It will transform victims' and witnesses' experiences of the justice system and ensure they are treated with compassion. As all these bills were progressed, the Justice Secretary worked constructively and collegiately with members across this chamber. She approached all of their suggestions to improve these bills with an open mind, and throughout her term in office, she has worked tirelessly to build a safer Scotland. She championed the rights of victims. She has worked to improve the conditions of those serving across our criminal justice system. She has made justice more accessible to all, and in particular for those who have suffered some of the most serious crimes. She has never shied away from asking tough questions about our approach to justice, nor has she ever avoided tackling some of the biggest issues that we face. For these reasons, Angela Constance has my full confidence as Justice Secretary. She is getting on with the job of making Scotland safer, and I urge members to enable her to continue doing that by rejecting this motion today.
Thank you. I now call on Anna Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, I speak in favour of the motion of no confidence in Justice Secretary Angela Constance, and I do so for one reason above all others. Because victims and survivors of grooming gangs and child sexual exploitation have lost confidence in this Justice Secretary. And what has led them to lose confidence is that they feel that the Justice Secretary and this government are not on their side. And this has been cemented by a clear breach of the Ministerial Code. Angela Constance misrepresented the views of Professor Alexis Jay on an issue as serious as grooming gangs and organised child sexual exploitation. In doing so, she misled this Parliament. Angela Constance has had multiple opportunities to correct the record. She has failed to do so. She has received repeated requests by Professor Alexis Jay herself to correct the record. She has failed to do so. This has now stopped being an error and become a matter of honesty and transparency. And let us be clear about why this matters. This is not an abstract argument about process or wording. This is about grooming gangs. The Justice Secretary misrepresented Professor Jay's views in order to find an excuse not to have an inquiry into grooming gangs. Victims and survivors should be able to rely on their justice system and their government to tell the truth, to act with integrity and to put them first. On this, the Justice Secretary has failed. I want to read the powerful words of Taylor's mum. Taylor is a brave survivor who has spoken out. Taylor's mum said, "Taylor is again feeling that she can trust no one, all because of this government's inability to be truthful and transparent." She said any MSP who chooses to support Angela Constance in this vote is choosing politics over victims. It's as simple as that. She went on to say, "You cannot say you stand with victims while defending a minister who lied to Parliament, the public and, more importantly, the survivors." But this has now also become a question of John Swinney's judgment and whether victims and the public can have confidence in him. Because Taylor's mum said, "My daughter and me attended Bute House last week. I travelled over 500 miles in a round trip to meet with the First Minister to spend 1.5 hours being lied to my face." That is utterly damning. John Swinney should have sacked Angela Constance, but he hasn't. Shamefully, he is not willing to even refer this to the independent advisers on the Ministerial Code. But it shouldn't be up to him. That's why I have written to the independent advisers on the Ministerial Code and asked them to investigate. The Justice Secretary has lost the confidence of victims. She has lost the confidence of survivors, and in my view, she should not have the confidence of this Parliament. She cannot continue in her role. So to every MSP in this chamber, I will end with Taylor's mum's words to you. Can you look yourselves in the mirror, knowing that you are supporting her to remain in position against the will of the victims? Can you? Wow. Shame on you, Mr Mason, for shouting that out. Shame on you. For every single, and shame on you too, Mr Brown, for shouting that out too. I'm quoting the words of the mother of a victim. So for them, this Parliament should support this motion of no confidence.
Thank you. I now call on Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am profoundly sad that we've got to this point. The Scottish Government can and should have handled this better, far better. But I doubt that would have dissuaded those who have used this issue for political advantage. We have seen already in recent weeks how detached it has become from the issue at the heart of this, protecting children from sexual abuse and securing justice for victims and survivors. I do not pretend to understand the trauma that survivors have gone through. I doubt that anyone who hasn't themselves gone through it can truly understand that pain. But I've spent a lot of time with survivors in this job, particularly during the establishment of Redress Scotland. And I appreciate how angry many of them are, that justified anger. And I respect that survivors are not a homogenous group who speak with one voice. I certainly don't claim to speak for them now. But the pain of having been let down, of having been failed by those who should have protected them as children, is near universal. And we could have used this afternoon to put questions to the Scottish Government about what additional action they are now taking to deliver justice for those who were failed, and to stop the same thing from happening to more children in the future. It's hard to think of anything more important for a government to do. We could have talked about the need to improve the Children's Bill that's due to pass before the election. We know that victims of this scandal are disproportionately care-experienced children and young people. And we have a bill in front of us that has unanimous support, but the frustration with it is almost equally unanimous. It's a bill intended to fulfil the promise, but it does not do so. And we're already talking about legislation required in the next session to meet that commitment. The Promise organisation themselves have said the bill doesn't fulfil the vision of the Independent Care Review. Almost 4 years ago, the Scottish Government committed to reviewing the legislation underpinning the care system with the aim of making it more understandable, less fragmented and more effective. That still hasn't happened, despite the total fragmentation of support being one of the contributing factors in grooming gangs being able to target and abuse children without anyone in a position of authority stopping them. We could have challenged the Justice Secretary on the huge problems in the legal aid system and the effect that that's having on survivors seeking justice. Reform of legal aid was promised for this Parliament but has not yet been delivered. We hear that there might be something before the election, but there are only 10 sitting weeks left. Parliament agreed that independent legal advice should be provided to victims of sexual offences via the Victims Bill. But that's irrelevant if there simply aren't enough solicitors taking on these cases. And we know that in some parts of the country there are none. Now, that's not an easy problem to solve, but unresolved, it shuts down access to justice for far too many people, including survivors of grooming gangs and other forms of child sexual abuse. We could have talked about the delayed update to relationship, sexual health and parenthood education guidance for schools. One of the simplest things we can do to protect children from sexual abuse is age and stage appropriate education on what that is, and critically, who they can go to.
Let's hear one another.
And critically, Presiding Officer, who they can go to if they or someone they know is being abused. But the current RSHP guidance is so out of date that it doesn't even have a section on the importance of consent. The updated draft, which is a huge improvement, could have been completed and published years ago. We could have used this afternoon to push the government to at least roll that out early in the new year. But we're not doing any of that now. I hope tomorrow at the Education Committee with the Cabinet Secretary and Professor Jay we will have the opportunity to put questions like that. This afternoon, though, is about politics, and I've got no time for that, which is why the Greens will vote against the motion this afternoon.
Thank you. We will hear Mr Greer.
The Greens will be voting against the motion this afternoon, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call on Jamie Green.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Liberal Democrats take no pleasure in this debate. We came to the view that today's vote is regrettable, as it was avoidable. When we deliberated our response to the motion of no confidence put forward, our discussion was tainted by a collective feeling of disappointment, no least because colleagues expressed much personal goodwill towards the Cabinet Secretary for Justice. And on a personal level, can I thank Ms Constance for the constructive attitude which allowed me to successfully progress my own victims' proposals into a government bill. But, Presiding Officer, sometimes in politics people make mistakes. To err is, of course, human. If the Cabinet Secretary misrepresented the views of a well-respected judicial figure, either purposefully or inadvertently, that is not for me to decide. But the correct and immediate course of action would have been to correct the record and to apologise to Parliament, to Professor Jay, and to the victims who should be at the centre of all our attention. There has been ample opportunity for that to happen in recent months. There has been ample opportunity to take ownership of the error. Instead, junior ministers have been put up to shield the flak. It is in fact 3 months to the day since the Cabinet Secretary made that erroneous assertion and the argument was presented to Parliament. An argument against an amendment from the Conservative benches to establish a bespoke inquiry into group-based child exploitation in Scotland, an amendment which we supported. But I do say, in response to the First Minister's comments today, I reread the official report this morning of that meeting, and there is no ambiguity whatsoever in what was said or how it could be interpreted. None whatsoever. In our view, the correct and proper response to this would have been a simple correction statement made to this chamber, which I believe could potentially have put the matter to bed. And that is why we believe that the vote today is the inevitable result of a series of events which could have been avoided and resolved. We, on these benches, bear no ill will to the Justice Secretary. We do not subscribe to any great sensationalist theory of conspiracy on her part, nor do we see any political opportunism in any of this whole saga. Indeed, the substance of the original debate from which all of this stems is one which I think merits the gravitas that it has not always been afforded in this place. But when ministers place on record a view which is based on false representation, then the Code demands that the record be put straight and with absolute candour. And that is yet to happen. Presiding Officer, the Scottish justice system is in both upheaval and crisis in equal measures. It is undergoing some of the most substantial changes to it in centuries, starting with the removal of the Not Proven verdict. Our prisons are in a state of crisis and condition which neither rehabilitates prisoners nor keeps people safe inside or outside. Serious violent crime and domestic violence is on the increase in far too many areas in Scotland. Victims and the accused are waiting years for their trials to come to pass. Our police force survives only on the goodwill of officers and largely of overtime. And of course, our national drug death crisis continues to be our national shame. It's such a critical period. Our justice sector needs to be led from the front and with confidence. The role of the Justice Secretary must command the confidence not just of this whole Parliament, but of every cog in the judicial wheel. But most importantly, I say, it must command the confidence of victims, particularly those who've suffered the most horrendous and unimaginable trauma and abuse. And they now tell us directly that that confidence has been lost. On that point alone, we will vote in favour of the motion today. But I would say, irrespective of the outcome, it is important that we all continue to act and work constructively and sensibly with the government in a minority parliament, as is right to do so. But lessons can and must be learnt from this and from the government's unacceptable response to the events which have led us to today's vote. Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And I now call on Rachel Hamilton to wind up the debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, we've been down this road before, calling for a vote of no confidence in ministers. In the past, we've called for people in charge to step down because of catastrophic exam results or misuse of public money. But this vote of confidence is darker, it is graver, it is potentially widespread and affecting thousands of young women. Vulnerable young girls gang raped and abused as young as 13, teenagers trafficked, drugged and plied with alcohol, waking up naked and bruised on a mattress with no recollection of the night before. There is a material difference in this vote of no confidence. In this case, the Parliament has been misled by the Justice Secretary responsible for safeguarding victims. Survivors of grooming gangs unforgivably let down. It is despicable. The First Minister did not address the substance of our motion today. Instead, he read out the Justice Secretary's CV, diverting from the substance. It was 80% deflection, 10% spin and 10% perhaps job reference. But our Scottish Conservative Party leader has set out the timeline, a timeline that demonstrates with clarity that the Justice Secretary has misled Parliament, a timeline that has been protracted for survivors and victims, a scale of events that escalated to such serious levels that survivors have lost trust in this government. It has taken months to reveal that Angela Constance clearly misrepresented Professor Alexis Jay's comments in relation to her view of my colleague Liam Kerr's amendment, which was voted down by the SNP and Greens. The Justice Secretary continued to deny misrepresenting Alexis Jay until, of course, correspondence confirmed that the current position was unsatisfactory to her. Finally, just a few weeks ago, the Scottish Government published email correspondence from Alexis Jay confirming that Angela Constance had misled Parliament. Still no correction or apology. Presiding Officer, you just couldn't make this up. Cabinet Secretaries have tied themselves in knots trying to defend their Justice Secretary. And let me remind Ross Greer that we have been standing up for victims of grooming gangs, not slavishly and spinelessly protecting this SNP government. We've seen a plethora of Cabinet Secretaries rolled out to shut down the truth. Over the course of a few weeks, Natalie Innes-Don responded to an urgent question from Megan Gallagher whilst the Cabinet Secretary sat in the chamber. Again, Megan Gallagher raised an inquiry through a business motion. No action, again. Tess White, Pam Gosell, Sharon Dowie and Douglas Ross called for an inquiry in the Violence Against Women and Girls debate led by Shirley-Ann Somerville and CoCab Stewart. Once again, no action. A Labour debate on group-based child sexual exploitation and abuse led by Jenny Gilruth and Angela Constance tabled, once again, no action. A point of order from my colleague Douglas Ross and an urgent question again from Douglas Ross. Again, no action. On top of this, there was an opportunity for John Swinney to respond to his Justice Secretary's lying in Parliament at 2 separate FMQs from my colleague Russell Finlay. No answers, just stonewalling, presiding officer. This is no way to treat victims of horrific crimes. As Taylor's mum said, where is the humanity for these young people who have to keep being re-traumatised time and time again, every time they speak out, in the hope that you will do the right thing? The survivors demand honesty and transparency. Presiding officer, John Swinney could have called an immediate inquiry. It is unclear why the First Minister has not called an immediate investigation or indeed instructed his cabinet to defend Angela Constance misleading Parliament. As my colleague Russell Finlay said, John Swinney met with Taylor and her mother a few weeks ago on the 9th of December. Taylor and her mum told the First Minister about the destruction and loss of vital evidence and records held by the government, the police, education, the NHS and local authorities. Victims' voices are clear. They do not want fobbed off. Transparency and honesty matters. It is not the SNP that the SNP are shy of inquiries, but this one really matters. This situation matters. It appears that their strategy has been to get it out of the road before Christmas and hope it goes away, and that people have forgotten about their disgraceful behaviour from the moment they voted down Liam Kerr's amendment and the behaviour by the Justice Secretary who has let down victims. Presiding officer, this stinks. This is on a different scale. Labour agree, the Liberal Democrats agree. Angela Constance must go for the sake of survivors and for thousands of others whose trust and confidence has been undermined by a cover-up.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on motion of no confidence. We'll now move to the question on the motion. The question is that motion 20135 in the name of Russell Finlay on a motion of no confidence be agreed. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we will suspend to allow access to the digital voting system.